this episode, we'll look at Rails engines, and an engine is basically a smaller Rails application that's mounted within a much larger one. And when we create the engine, it's going to have the same look and feel as a normal gem, but there's going to be a few extra folders and some extra settings. And two great examples of engines, one is Devise, and another is Storekeeper. So there's a chance that you've been using these in your application without ever even knowing that these were engines. But these are two good examples to show how you can create a gem that's a mountable Rails engine and then extend the functionality of your application fairly simply with the addition of the engine. So the application that we're going to create today is basically a favorite books club. So we'll first create our engine, and you can do this by just typing Rails plugin new books module, and this is just the name of the engine that we're going to create, and then pass in the -- mountable. So the first thing that we need to do is come into the books module gem spec, and this should look familiar if you've ever inspected or if you've ever created a gem. And the first thing that we have to do is update our homepage, summary, and description to remove our to-do tags. Then let's take a tour of the file hierarchy. So we have an app folder, and this is going to look very similar to our Rails application, where we have an assets folder, and within here we have our images, and then our JavaScripts, and style sheets. However, do note that we do have a namespace for each one of these, which means that we're able to keep our images, JavaScripts, and style sheets all contained in the namespace. And again, everything in the application is namespace. So if we look at our application controller, you'll see that it has the module books module, and then we have our normal class application controller. And then under the test folder, you'll see that we had this dummy folder, and this is a sample Rails application. So if we look at the config folder, this dummy application, and look at the routes, you'll see that we're mounting the books module engine to the books module path. So this is something that you may want to put in your README of the engine. And when I'm designing the engine, I tried to keep it as unobtrusive to the main application as possible, and we'll see what I mean by this in a few minutes here. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the test dummy folder. And from within here, I'm going to go ahead and create a scaffold for the users. And we're just doing this so we can basically test out what the main application would look like and how we can interact with it. So we created a user scaffold with the first name and the last name, and I'll go ahead and run the rakedb migrate. We can then change the directory back to the root of our Rails engine. We're going to create another scaffold, and we're going to call this one books with a name and a year. And again, we can call rakedb migrate. And then within our test dummies config and in the routes.rb file, I'm going to set the root index to our user's index. And similar for the books module, under the config routes, we're going to set our root index to the books index. And then within the dummy application, under the views users index, I want to add a link to our mountable engine. And to do this, we'll just create a normal link, but then we'll call books engine and then .books path. And we'll create this books engine within our routes of the dummy application. So under the config folder in the routes, we're then going to modify our books module engine, and then we're just going to pass a as, and then we're going to pass in the books engine. And likewise, within our engine under the app views, books module, books, index, I want to create a link at the bottom back to our main application. And we can use this using main app, and then we can follow any of the normal routes that we have within our main application, and in our case, the user's path. So starting up the application, from the root of the engine in the books module, we can simply just call Rails S, and this will launch the dummy application. So if we navigate to our localhost port 3000, you'll see that we can create users. And then we can also go to our books. So notice that when we created the scaffold, we had the scaffold CSS layout, and I left it in here on purpose because I want to illustrate that the layouts are not inherently found within the books module, which is our Rails mountable engine. So if we click on books, you can see that now we have gone to the books module, which is now within the engine, and we're on the books index path. And within here, we can create new books. So it creates it successfully as we would expect, and then we can now see our list of books, and we can always navigate back to our users. So next, let's create a migration where we're going to add the books ID to the user's model. We can do this by calling Rails generate migration, add book ID to users, and then we're going to add the book ID integer, and we're going to go ahead and index this column. And be sure to run your rakedb migrate. and then in our books model, and then we can add has many users. And this is where things become a little bit tricky. So let's say if we wanted to create the association, so we have a belongs to books with the class name of the books module, and we do have to pass optional true. We then have a method has favorite book, and we just check if the book is present. While you could add this into our user model, I really don't like doing it here because then this Rails engine gem is going to be heavily tied into the main application. Instead, I like to extract any kind of logic like this and keep it within the gem and then just have a simple includes. So under our engine, under the lib folder books module, I'll create a new file, and within here I'm just going to call require relative and then the models user.rb. And then we'll have to create this folder in hierarchy. And I'll just call this file model.rb. So again, under the lib books module folder, we can create a new folder and we'll just call this models. And then within here, we will create a new file and then we'll just call this user.rb. And within this user model, we'll create the namespace for the books module. Then we'll just create this name users model. And the important bits is to extend from the active support concern. And then in the included to block, we then basically just put in our methods and our association calls. And the last bit that we need to do to tie our applications together with the engine is under the engine's lib. And in the books module.rb, we just need to, within the books module, just put in the require relative for our books module and then the model.rb. And back in our dummy application in the user model, we can then comment out all of that stuff and then simply just have the include books module and then the user module. And then within our users form partial of the dummy application, we can then call a class and then we can create our book ID and a collection select from our books module, book all, and this should return all of the books. We want the key to be the ID and with the name, and then include a blank. And with restarting our Rails application, we can now go back to our list of users, edit one of the users, and then we can select our book. And once we select our book and update the user, it says it was successfully updated. However, if we look at our Rails logs, you'll see that the book ID is not a allowed parameter, and because this is on the user model within our dummy application, we will need to allow this ID. So within the user's controller, the dummy application, we can then just go towards the bottom, and then we can add the book's ID. And then within the user's index action, I'm going to add a new column where it has a favorite book. Then we'll create the column the user has favorite book. And you'll see that we are adding this in here, even though our user model doesn't have it, because we did the includes, we now have access to this method. So going back to our application and refreshing now, we'll see that John does not have a favorite book. However, if we create a new user, and if we select a book, we should now be able to save it. And if we look back, now Jane has a favorite book. And we can also interact within our books module to list out the number of users who has that particular favorite book. So within our books index, we can just add a new column and then we can call books.users.size, and then we should be able to see the size of the users. So back at the application, we can refresh and then we can see that we have one user. If we go back to our users and then change John's favorite book, and if we select Spider-Man as well, we can then go back and go to our books, and now we see we have two users. And finally, when you go to use the Rails engine within another application, you may find that you need to install the migrations, and you can do this by calling rake books module install migrations. And then within the application, you'll see that it'll just copy the migrations from the engine's migration folder over into your Rails application. Well, that's all for this episode. Thank you for watching. For more videos, check out driftandruby.com.